Hi, Sophie. Thank you, Maddie, for such a great intro. Um, so I guess I'll just get started. It's not a super long presentation. I probably only about 25, 30 minutes. And the goal of it is for everybody to get thinking about maybe some discussion. If you have any questions, really don't be shy. I mean, I have my glass of wine here. It's you're among friends, and this is to create conversation and to yeah, like expand upon our art form in curious and interesting ways. So please feel free to keep it cash. So here we go. My name's Danielle Jagelski. Like Maddie said, I'm a conductor originally from the Northwest, and I'm currently living in New York City. I'm from the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and Red Cliff Band of Ojibwe and of Polish-Irish heritage. And thank you for being here with my discussion about mixed race identity in classical music. Before I begin, I want to thank Renegade, of course, for organizing this lecture, and especially thank the community surrounding us for their support, and thank you so much for being here. And I'd love to draw attention to the peoples whose homelands we're on, the Multnomah, Clackamas, Chinook, Molalla tribes that are currently and historically in the Portland area and call that home. And my tribe, the Oneida Nation, along with the other 4 tribes of the Iroquois Confederacy who have called and are calling the New York area home. And of course, a huge thanks to all of the people that I have interviewed as part of this research since 2018. So most musical organizations and ensembles and institutions have are of learning generally share a belief that the wealth of knowledge and artistry found in all cultures is an exciting frontier for classical musicians to explore. By expanding the canon to include knowledge and traditions from non-dominant cultures, the Western classical landscape continues to expand with music previously unknown to the classical ear. However, as the acknowledgement of racially and culturally diverse musical populations become more popular with organizations, performers, and listeners, there begs the question, what does diversity actually mean? Is the way we define diversity neglecting to acknowledge the experience of individual people? Are we striving to be truly inclusive, or are we simply checking the box, resulting in tokenizing, pigeonholing, or even omitting significant cultural characteristics? I first began this research when I noticed a gap in the canon when it comes to mixed race individuals, and in my own experience, found myself asking which part of me served my career goals best. I knew from talking to other people of various backgrounds, especially other natives, that this was a question very present in our lives, especially as musicians. However, when I researched diversity in the classical music realm, though there's a wealth of knowledge about diversity in a broad sense, there is not much to be found about mixed race people or multiculturalism specifically. So before we delve into the nitty gritty, I'll first explain the ways I'll be using certain terms. And as always, put it in the chat if something gets a little too academic here. Or of course, we can discuss it afterwards as well. So mixed race and multiracial will be used interchangeably throughout the presentation and refers to a person who self-identifies of having 2 or more different racial backgrounds. Monoracial, someone who identifies from being from one race. Multicultural will also be used to refer to someone from 2 or more cultural backgrounds, but not necessarily 2 or more racial groups. Dominant culture, the culture that is perceived to pertain the majority of the population, so the norm or the Joneses. So usually referring to white, Eurocentric, monoracial, socioeconomically stable, male, able-bodied, etc., the norms. More definitions. Minority presenting is someone who presents as a person of color within the dominant culture. White presenting, someone who looks white. I will use this interchangeably with the term white adjacent in the words of writer Alec Laughlin, which mostly means that friends will often forget that you're not totally white. Native, American Indian, First Nations, Indigenous will all be used interchangeably to refer to people indigenous to North America. I'd also like to add that I opted to use the term people of color and mixed race people rather than non-white. I'm aware that the term people of color can be problematic and reinscribe the non-race status of whiteness. However, the term non-white centers whiteness and arguably colonizes the research space. So in all of my interviews, we use people of color and mixed race people rather than non-white. Additionally, much of the presentation will be focused on people who are white as part of their background. This is simply because I'm Native and white, and therefore, at this stage of documentation, I felt more comfortable drawing preliminary conclusions within my own subset. Mixed race people of multiple minority backgrounds were not excluded from the research, but make up about 20% of the interviews I've conducted so far. Since 2018, over 50 musicians have shared their stories, some in person and some digitally. These people come from many different age groups, races, socioeconomic and educational backgrounds, and at many stages of their musical careers. All identify as being mixed race and musicians. The sample includes students currently attending music school at the conservatory and university level, professional opera singers, professional orchestral musicians, composers, ethnomusicologists, and music therapists from various regions of the US and Canada. Many of the interviewees were found online through Facebook groups listed on the slide. An interesting side note is I received the most response and interest from a meme or like humor comedy group called Prelude, Fugue, and Shitpost, and the least from American Choral Directors Association. I'd like to begin the nitty-gritty part of our discussion with some quotes from the interviews. They're all written on the slides, but I'll read them out loud for all you guys that are just tuning in with the audio. I feel that I'm in the middle of a Venn diagram of three cultures. I really hope this research can do something towards building a classical music community that has a real and authentic room for voices and experiences that differ from the white, secular, and affluent norm. My grad school thought it was such a place, but it became clear pretty quickly when my experience differed from the box they had put me into. They had expectations of my worldview as a woman of color that I didn't fulfill. That they only wanted classical music to be for people who think and act just like them. That's not diversity at all. It's ideological uniformity with a token dose of color allowed, and it's not a victory for anybody. People on audition panels ask where my last name comes from, which I've always thought is a polite way of figuring out what my ethnic origin is. I don't look ethnic. I looked white to the majority of Mexican American population when I went to school. I'm from the East LA suburbs, but as I went to university and then grad school, I realized that most white people don't think I look white. I am constantly getting asked if I'm half Asian. For many years, I didn't try to claim being a Latina. When I fill out a form, I'll place Hispanic as my race. Most forms don't give an option for multi. There is the other box, but I don't think that box should exist. Biracial students should have a box for themselves at this point. I feel that they don't count Asians as diversity in classical music most of the time, and I'm half white anyways, so I just try to get over it. The overarching theme of these quotes is it's hard to explain who I am, or I'm basically insert culture here. I interpret this as, at least in some cases, they're not words readily available to describe these people's cultural, racial, and community experiences. It's accepted that their identity is complicated. However, I argue that their identity is just as complicated or not complicated as anyone else's. We, as a society, just have not granted the space within our cultural institutions to acknowledge and explore these hard to explain identities. Mixed race people are considered so complicated that they're often not acknowledged on panels and data collections, and anyone who's ever wondered what box should I check knows that very well. Because of this, I chose to continue this area of study by collecting and documenting stories rather than by collecting numbers. One, there are just simply no numbers to collect, really, and also there is so much variance with each individual that to reduce them down to a number statistic is a disservice to DEI work and the future equity in musical spaces. Not knowing how to describe your background or choosing not to expend the energy that a lengthy explanation entails results in what we call thin descriptions of identity. The meta-narratives that exist in our society are influenced most strongly by the dominant culture: white, European, male, straight, able-bodied, affluent, urban, etc. And if you don't fit into these cultures, you're considered outside of the norm. When I say meta-narratives, I mean the accepted narratives within society. So going back to the Joneses, you fit into this box. Oh, I'm a person, I'm a woman from Chicago, I have a baby, I went to college, etc. So anything you can think of as acceptable, that you could write a story about it, basically. So in my interviews, I heard, I'm basically, insert race here. I'm an apple, red on the outside, white on the inside. It's complicated. As explained by Walters in her 2016 article titled From the 1970s to the 1790s, The Importance of Metanarratives, she describes, metanarratives are the fundamentals of what drives the way society, power, class, oppression, and injustice are organized. These narratives can limit the way in which people are able to conceptualize their identity and experience. For example, in an interview with a music student, she described being raised in a rural area. She said, "Everyone wants me to describe my experience as a woman of color, but honestly, I feel white, even though I know people don't see me as white." She went on to say that everyone around her is white and her mother's from India. When she was growing up, there was no one around like her. So even though she identifies as white, she has a relevant and important perspective when it comes to the idea of mixed race theory, but perhaps hasn't been given the opportunity to explore this concept, or perhaps she doesn't want to, and both are fantastic. But she should be giving the opportunity and the choice by knowing that there are these options that she can take, or she can build her own option. She should know that it's not complicated, and that she doesn't have to be basically something. By limiting the way people are able to conceptualize themselves and others, we may be forcing those who do not fit in these meta-narratives to distort their identity to fit within social parameters. As one interviewee said, "Sometimes I feel like a round block being pushed in a square hole." Even though the mixed race population is getting larger by the year, people are generally asked to fit within something that is easily identifiable and understood within the current society. As artists, educators, and citizens, we must be especially careful about the narratives we contribute to. We must value and co-create new narratives that foster greater forms of freedom and liberation. A crucial step in creating a freer narrative is to become critically aware of your own identity and your relative position of power within the current meta-narratives. This is the first step in unmasking the power relationships that masquerade as common sense within current society. In a quest to examine my own place in the current meta-narratives and create a space where I could thicken the description of my identity, if you will, is where the inspiration for this documentation of stories began. Who am I as an artist? Am I more likely to be selected to present at conferences if I write about Native stuff? Are my thoughts and views on Nativeness okay to have, since in many communities I'm white adjacent? Should I study ethnomusicology because I'm a tribal member and have access to anthropological resources from the inside? Am I less Native than my sisters because they're darker than I am? Can I write about my mother's experiences and her as a brown woman? Why am I, even now, feeling as if I have to defend my status as a Native person? Am I a white woman or am I Native? Should I just call myself generic Native, or should I say Grandpa's Ojibwe, Grandma's Oneida, other grandparents are fiery Polish Irish Catholics, so I guess that makes me confused. But jokes aside, the answer is that I'm all of these things, but there's no prepackaged narrative that easily and painlessly allows my identity to be known. My identity is complicated because it does not fit within the society's meta-narratives, not because it is more complicated than anyone else's identity. The lack of diverse meta-narratives is a self-serving machine where people with identities outside the norm, when asked about their experiences, often don't have the energy to explain it to every person who's asking the question. For me, it's easier to let people believe that I'm white than to explain my background and help contribute to a new meta-narrative. The first step to this solution may be for people to realize where in the dominant culture's meta-narratives they fit, and also to realize that a person of color, woman, mixed race person, etc., is not obligated to mutilate their identity in order to form an easy explanation. A question that is often asked is, how do I not take up space that should be held by my mixed race or person of color, colleague, student friend, etc.? You can't discuss another person's experience. However, you can discuss yours. Discuss and explore the places of power you hold in society. For instance, if you're affluent, discuss how that impacts your life. What opportunities are more easily achieved because of your wealth? If you're white or white adjacent, discuss whiteness and the place of power it puts you in. Find ways of rethinking and reperforming these places of privilege that don't reinscribe the hegemony of that privilege. This can be applied to any type of privilege, whether it's gender, socioeconomic status, race, anything you can think of. I mean, language is a huge one. And in the classical music world, people that came out of pre-college, like music pre-college and then in conservatory, or people that came out of state schools, you can analyze your position like to the nth degree. And I would encourage you to do it. It's kind of interesting. Diversity has too long been a problem to be dealt with by the non-dominant group. However, in order for an inequitable ideology to be truly accepting of a non-dominant group, especially confusing identities such as mixed race people, the ideology inscribing the hegemony of the dominant group must be identified and acknowledged, analyzed and understood, and collectively dismantled. For example, a crucial step in identifying a meta-narrative within the dominant culture is knowing your own identity. For example, whiteness must be identified, given a name, before people with complicated racial identities that include whiteness can begin to be represented as unique and valid identities, rather than just a part of this and a part of that. Hybrids, pretty white, not really black, or basically white. Based on my interviews, this type of hybridization belief is definitely present and perhaps damaging to many mixed race people that are minority or white presenting. The study of whiteness can be a hard sell because the Eurocentric perspectives are often felt strongly by minority musicians and go unnoticed by white musicians. In music classrooms, conferences, organizations, etc., the tendency is to examine social issues of racial diversity as something pertaining to musicians of color only, not as something that white musicians must explore themselves. For me, a powerful word in the last slide is collectively. Get to know your community. Get to know the people around you. Equally educate yourself in your relative position of power within the current meta-narratives, as well as other people's relative position within the power structure. Make diversity a subject for everyone. Don't focus on being the champion for a disadvantaged group, but rather what you can do within your own group and your own community to make a more equitable world. While delving into these interviews, there were many common themes. For example, the feeling of being raced. Here's a quote from Susan Hadley's book, Experiencing Race as a Music Therapist. In class, we were talking about race and the challenges of being a music therapist. Immediately, I asked a Japanese American student about her experience. The student responded, "Why are you asking me?" The teacher at that point had, without permission, raced the person of color in the room, making them the other. By doing this, the student was asked to speak for an entire community, and in some ways, the instructor took away the student's chance to represent themselves as an individual. Many of the people I interviewed and many of my own experiences have been like this. For natives, the common question is, what is the correct way to refer to you guys? This question is great to ask an individual, but speaking for the Indigenous community as a whole is impossible. My grandma says, I'm an American Indian. My mom says, I'm a Native American. My uncle says, I'm Indigenous. I say, I'm Native, I'm mixed race. In interviews with Latinx musicians, the same theme shows up. In many Latinx communities, the word Latinx is rejected by the older population and is viewed as a way that non-Latinas show that they're woke. So back to the point, see, acknowledge the individual. Simply always do your very best at seeing the person and not the politics of their identity. Another great example, we'll go back for one. It's a good slide, but you can't see me, so we'll go here. Another good example of seeing the person and not the politics of their identity is if you're choosing to commission a composer and you want to commission a composer of color. Ask yourself, are you acknowledging this person's music for reasons other than that they are a diverse composer? Are you choosing them to please your majority white audience? Or are you choosing the piece because it fits your program and your ensemble? Are you getting to know this music and this composer with the same earnest that you would commission a white composer with? Are you implying that the composer of color should write about people of color stuff? Or are you actually interested in their composition process and their personal identity as an artist? As we, as the industry and as individuals, move to implement more diversity in our work, we need to constantly remind ourselves of this. And that's, I think, the only way to stop the pigeonholing and to stop the tokenization. We have to see the person and not the politics of their identity. Now we're at the good part. Continuing to actively explore and define what diversity means is pertinent in maintaining a classical music community. It's pertinent in maintaining a musical community where new art and interpretations can come to fruition. By nurturing an inclusive community, we're encouraging varied and diverse viewpoints. This allows for the musical community to reflect more accurately the world at large. By welcoming and creating space for a fuller understanding of diversity, this in hand exposes the audiences and musicians to a more diverse set of interpretations, which in turn more adequately represents the increasingly diverse classical music population, while at the same time co-creates new narratives that contribute to a more inclusive community, which starts the whole cycle over again. So I'll just give us a moment to look at this a little closer, because I truly believe that this is why diversity is so important in the arts, because it's the way that it evolves. It's the way that we get new ideas. It's the way we create new things. And I think it really all starts with having an inclusive community in the correct ways. From what I've gathered in these interviews, an important step in avoiding tokenization is gathering knowledge about people's individual experiences, as well as seeking out studies in academic thoughts. With such a new and nebulous subject, learning about mixed race theory and mixed race experience is, from just reading articles, would be like reading a book about a foreign country and then claiming that you've lived there. As we all know, there are many things that only experience can explain, no matter how beautiful, poetic, artistic the writer may be. We all experience life through me-tinted glasses. So it's often helpful to think about the places in your life, if any, that you live one step in and one step out, a place where each foot is on either side of the aisle. I'd like to conclude with two quotes. The first is from a Black and white mixed man born in 1941 and was recorded by Kathy Tashiro's book, Voices of Older Mixed Race Americans, speaking about his discovery of the possibility of a mixed race identity. All of a sudden, I realized I was standing on 2 feet and that I'd been hopping around on 1 foot back and forth all my life, and I didn't know. I didn't know I was hopping until I got both feet on the ground at the same time. I said, damn, this feels pretty good. It has to do with how secure can you be on 1 foot. It's very difficult to be secure. Keep your balance. When I've got both feet on the ground, I can feel secure. I can feel grounded. I am grounded. And lastly, and in reference to each of our personal journeys, as well as our journey as a collective community, a quote from the great Miles Davis: "It takes a long time to sound like yourself." Thank you.
Danielle, that was
Well,
beautiful. I just loved hearing the quotes from everyone. I felt like that was so powerful. So thank you for sharing those. And of course, all of the wonderful information.
yeah, no problem. Well, yeah, does anybody have any questions or would like to discuss a certain point that I made further, or just tell me that that made no sense and to explain it again?
I guess I can start. I was really intrigued about the idea of creating some sort of internal dialogue within yourself about where you stand in the power complex, and that is something that I have been thinking about a lot as we've been going through this year of quarantine and lots of social justice work and just everything that's going on, really owning and researching your own identity, everyone's own identity within this complex structure that we live in. And I wonder, have you thought about any ways to foster sort of like workshops around that, or is that part of this work for you?
Yeah, analyzing your place within different power structures is definitely a big task. So I think the harder it is, the more, at least in my experience, the harder it was for me to like recognize my place of power within a certain power structure, the more privileged I knew I was in that. So, for example, I grew up in a place that didn't have a lot of sexism. So when it came to talking about sexism and everything, it was harder for me to like understand. And so as I learned about all these different power structures, another one was that I've always been like fortunately economically stable. So that was another one. It was much harder for me to recognize that. But when it came to explaining your identity, I was immediately like, oh yeah, I know how to do that. So I think that is a great first step. Like you can find the one that's hardest for you to understand. I think for many people that are white and from white communities, it's that they say like, oh, well, I'm poor and that makes it hard for me. But so they can't acknowledge that like, oh, I do hold a place of privilege within the racial power structure, even if I don't hold a place of privilege within the socioeconomic power structure. So I think that's a great tool to start to analyze your own personal identity and your own personal places of power within the communities and within society, if that's what your question was.
Absolutely. I think, yeah, finding those blind spots where you're like, well, I don't have to think about that. Then you're like, wait, no, that's exactly what I need to think about.
Yeah,
Oh,
kind of. It's kind of insidious, right? And so
right.
that's where, yeah, that's where like the hard work has to be done. Because of course, when you feel the pain of something, it's easy to feel. But when it's not hurting you, you don't notice it, right? Like you have a bum knee, you're focusing on your knee. You aren't noticing your elbow that's like working so great because that power structure is working for you. Your arm works really well for you, but your leg, not so much. So you're like, yeah, that one. But I'm saying focus on your whole body.
Right. Yeah, and be able to own the places that you do have power and also know the places that you don't have power. And maybe own is the wrong word, right? But sort of rethink how you use the power that you are recognizing that you have.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, recognizing the power is definitely the first, the first stop in that, and that if we encourage other people to do that, it creates a community where there's a lot less judgment and there's just a lot more space for creativity and a lot like you don't have to fight as much, you know. So, yeah, thanks for the question. So, Derek.
Derek, yeah, Derek had a question in the chat. Do you want to read it out? Yeah, go for it.
Sure. He says, I'm mainly a jazz musician. Was everyone you interviewed in the classical music spectrum, or does it carry over into other art forms? Not necessarily music either. So the large majority of the people I interviewed were classical musicians, but I do have lots of crossover artists included in there. I think specifically because it's people of color. So often, like if you're Latina, then they've done some like Latin music, or a lot of people came from different types of church backgrounds. And there were a couple jazz musicians in there. And I do think it carries over into any, like broadly into the world and especially into any organized activities. So this can be applied to education in general. It can be applied to a nonprofit. It can be applied to a for-profit. And it definitely can be applied, I think, most importantly, to any artistic field, because the goal, for me at least, is to create a space where we continue the cycle of creation and where there's more space and more there's more ideas. And because in classical music, we're always saying it's dying, nobody wants classical music, it's boring, blah 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 blah. And I'm saying, yeah, it's boring. So how do we fix that? And the people I know at school and like my friends, all this stuff, I'm like, it's not boring what they're doing. So how do we get this cycle to continue and to grow and grow, and so that the whole industry can be as excited and as accepting of new ideas? So Ophir, you raised your hand.
Yeah, I had I had a related question, because for me, like, most of the discussion sounds very familiar, even though I'm not from the classical music realm, and I think it kind of operates very similarly in basically everywhere, kind of regardless of the field. And I'm curious if you can see something that is like very unique in that discussion within the classical music. Like, how does that operate differently than, because we all know it is like that everywhere. So I'm curious what's special about the classical world.
Definitely. Well, I think something that's special, or that is a particular problem within the classical music, which could also be extended to the other classical arts, is that our history and our education is based, it's a Eurocentric art, right? It's Western classical music. It came from Western Europe. And we all study Mozart, Beethoven, Stravinsky, Wagner, and those were all white European men, right? But I think something that we could apply this work to is to tell a truer history of that. So when we talk about Wagner, I don't know if you're familiar with Wagner, the composer, but he was an anti-Semite, like raging anti-Semite. And like his music was played at Hitler's funeral. So, and we as a classical music society acknowledge that, and we talk a lot about Wagner's anti-Semitism. But I think that can also be applied to all of the other greats, all of the other great composers. Even if they weren't particularly racist, we could talk about the different cultural groups that lived in Germany at that time and what Beethoven might have been hearing and how that influenced the music then. And then I think that in itself expands the canon, because we'll be like, oh, okay, there was this type of folk music. These people were immigrating from this place. This happened there, because it's really all connected. And I think so often in classical music, we want to think it's this linear line, and it never is, of course. And so I think telling like the truest history you can about composers and performers from all genders and ethnic and racial backgrounds is something that's definitely possible, and that in the classical music we choose to ignore right now, unfortunately. Thanks for your question.
I have a question, Danielle.
Yeah.
So your presentation talks a lot about like changes we can make internally and individually to create a more inclusive and diverse classical music industry. And there probably also needs to be like logistical changes and action changes to actively create space for like new voices and stuff. And I was wondering if there were any action items that you had been thinking about or are excited about. Like I heard someone talking about term limits as a way to say to like white musicians who've been in an orchestra for a long time, like, thank you for your time, but it's time to make space for like an emerging person of color.
Yeah, well, also because they're old and bad. I mean, they have no chops anymore. So I hate to say it, but you're too old. Yeah. So if people that are unfamiliar with the classical, especially the orchestral world, they have tenure, just how a professor has tenure. So you could win your audition when you're 25 and you're a killer player, and then you're still there when you're 75 and your fingers don't work anymore. And so that, and it creates a lot of problems in a lot of places. But yes, especially steps into problems with diversity initiatives. And yeah, I think there are tons of action items, and I'm not an expert on that. I'm kind of more talking about the what we need to do before we do those action items to make sure that they are true and valid and coming from the right place. So I'll just go back to my little, my favorite little, what is it called, cycle that I made. Here we go. So with this, this is kind of my action item, I guess, and each of these could have their own list of action items underneath, right? So to create an inclusive community, we can start here on the top. And so to me, that means to actually know your community. So look around in your community that you have of your fellow musicians. Do you have friends of color? Do you have friends of different gender and ethnic backgrounds? And I don't mean go out and like be like, oh my God, you're Native, let's be friends. But I mean, like, are you personally open to expanding your community and getting to know the people in your community? I think that is especially true for artistic organizations that might be in rural areas. So you have artistic organizations that the half of the population that they're serving in their community is Latinx, but you see them focusing very hard on promoting African American musicians, which I think that's wonderful. But it makes a lot more sense for them to engage with the Latinx community, because that's who's going to contribute to their community, and that's who their music is going to be serving. And I think multiculturalism, you can't just throw a wide net at it. Like, it has to start small. It has to start with your own community, and then it expands out from there. And so then if they were this hypothetical small community orchestra in a 50% Latinx community, if they were to market and program and serve their community of Latinx audience members, that would expose them as well as their white audiences to a varied and diverse viewpoints. And they'll be heard, and they'll start to recognize, like, oh wow, let's listen to this. Like, oh, I'm used to seeing Latinx people in the concert hall now. They don't just come for the tango night. Like, oh, we are in this, the community starts to being built. And so this allows for the musical community to reflect the world more at large, and then expands a little bit more. And that provides opportunity, like money, like actual resources and willingness from the community to see a new artistic vision and material. It creates trust within their community that people will still keep buying tickets. So they have this community, and then they're like, we want to promote African American composers. And they say, yeah, I trust you. Like, we don't have a lot of African American people in our community, but yeah, heck yeah, I want to see that. And so they come, and that is a very practical thing that they can do. They trust in their organization. And then that exposes the audiences and musicians to a more diverse set of interpretations, creates more adequate representation, which creates an even more inclusive community. And then you can see how the cycle just starts going over and over. Does that make any sense?
Do you know of case studies like that, of like a specific place or program that have done something like that and was successful?
Yes, the only one that I found out actually about it this year. So I created this circle in 2018, and since then they weren't influenced by me, but hopefully they were thinking the same thing. It's the California Symphony. It's a small regional symphony, and the executive director, her name is Aubrey Bergauer. And any classical music people, you need to go look her up. She's awesome. And that was actually the example I was pulling off of when I was saying my tools just now, because they have a very heavily Latinx community, and that orchestra was about to go under. And then within 5 seasons, they have upped their donations 5 times. They are one of the only orchestras right now that are running in the black, and they are like extremely successful, and their organization is growing exponentially. While we have here in New York, the Met couldn't even survive 3 months after the shutdown. So another, like, if you just want to be practical about it, like, forget the morals. No, the morals are the most important part, of course.
I have a question. I think it's a quick question. Because a lot of your interviews were with young professionals and with like students at a collegiate level. I'd be curious to know if there's, since this is such a growing body of research and a growing demographic, if there's bodies of research pointed at younger music students who've sort of fit into this nebulous space of identity, and like your identity as a musician and your identity as a performer are forming at the same time as you're exploring these meta narratives. So I'd be curious to know if you know of any body of work about what it's like to be a young person studying, a really young person, like a 10-year-old studying
really
classical music.
You know, I don't know any off the top of my head, but there definitely should be, because you're exactly right that the formation of your identity is integral in the formation of your art and of creating something real, right? And I think with children that are increasingly more mixed race, like, I mean, it was illegal. Mixed marriages were illegal, like our parents were alive when they were still illegal. And so, but now there is so much more multiculturalism, and there's so much more acceptance of racial diversity and ethnic diversity and community diversity, everything about it. And so I think it's something that needs to happen now, you know, like we need to be allowing these children to build their identities in unique ways rather than suppressing them. So for example, Native kids. So it's like with Native, we have the blood quantum. So after you're not a fourth Native anymore, then you're technically not Native in the eyes of the government. So this is a form of continued genocide. And if we can combat that by saying like, no, there's so much more to your identity than just if you have 1/4 blood. And the same on the opposite side of the coin is African American people, the one drop rule, right? So in pre-colonial, or not pre-colonial, but in the South, when the South was bad, maybe the South's still bad, but if you have 1 drop of Black blood, then you're Black. And so that's also a form of oppression. And so if we can cut through these established norms and start encouraging people to create their own story, to know their stories and explore those stories, then I think that is where we really need to go in the arts. And we can start that by doing it ourselves, by looking into our lives and exploring like where we sit in society and what narratives we can tell to our students, and to encourage them to also explore themselves in that way.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, if there's nothing else, I just really want to thank everybody for being here. It's a great turnout for an academic talk, so I'm really stoked about it. And I'm just going to plug it one more time. If you like seeing this kind of stuff from Renegade, then you can head on over to our website and drop us some money. You know, we would love it. And also be looking out this summer. We're doing our first in-person show, Orfeo in Underland, which is the last weekend of July. And I hope to see you guys all there. I think Maddie might have some closing words as well.
Barely any. Just to say thank you to Danielle. It is so wonderful to hear your perspective and your knowledge. So thank you for being here. Thank you, as Danielle said, to everybody for joining us.